Welcome in the name of Marie Denkens and Wim Peters in the gallery Office Baroque. I'd like to welcome you to this artist talk with David Diao in the exhibition of which you are currently sitting. I will very shortly introduce David. You can find a longer bio at the window, but I'm going to use the introduction to kick off my first question. So David, you arrived in the mid-50s as a 12-year-old boy in New York, and then you decided to study art, and so you came or became an artist, let's say in the mid-60s probably, which was a period of time for many of us is considered a very maybe exotic almost period in art history where a lot of things happened, especially in New York. So you must have met a lot of people.
Well,
you worked with a lot of people.
through the rosy lenses of history, yes, it was always better back then.
And
yeah. Well, artists oftentimes are asked questions about how they began, and you have two types of artists. One says, "Oh, I've always known I want to be an artist since I was 3 years old," and then the truth of the matter in my case is, I had no idea that I was going to be an artist. It's almost as if being an artist found me, and I didn't choose it. It's like by default, so to speak. And also, I did not study art. And, a lot of my behavior has to do with an incredible kind of diffidence about the fact that I had not studied art. So it made me a more conscientious person, perhaps, when I'm making art.
And why I started this way was to try and we're sitting in a show that addresses the body of work and the practice of one canonical figure in art history that was working at the time you started out. So can you tell us a little bit, because I think they're partly anecdotes, but they're also, I think, art historically important facts about Barnett Newman as a person, to which extent you met him and you knew him. For some in the room, it might be a familiar story, but I think for many it is not. So can you just tell us a little bit how well you knew the person? Because if you devote so much time in your practice to his
work. I don't know him intimately. He was a figure who I respected even before I met him in person. I very fortunately was able to help with the hanging of his Stations of the Cross show in the spring of 1966. But then I was just a simple young guy who was asked to hold up one end of the painting and help hang it and so forth. But I think what led me to actually begin with, to keep it, I'm sorry, it's a torturing instrument. What led me to actually begin the first work about him was from this book. I'm a great, yes, why don't you show it and I'll just continue to speak. It's a book about the complete drawings of Barnett Newman at the Baltimore Museum. And it happens to have a chart enumerating under each category of work, drawings, paintings, prints, sculpture, so forth, the number and the year of the work under which it was made. A very simple diagram. And what I noticed is how few works this guy did. Already he had a kind of incredible presence and stature in the art world. But here is this guy, so important, and yet he made probably 120 paintings in his entire 27-year career. So one, I was astonished by this fact, and two, the paucity of production is also what allowed me to deal with the subject, because I could be astounded by how productive Picasso's work is, but it would be very difficult to try to do what I was doing, showing 7,000 works. The fact that it's only 120 works was a kind of lucky break to allow me to deal with the subject.
Can you elaborate a little bit how you decided to turn it into a painting? Because there is something different between you reading a book at home, looking at a diagram, and reflecting on an artist's career, work, and what it means, and how it might relate to your own practice, to then decide to make.
I don't know how I came up with it, but already I was a painter with a particular history of having made groups of works for some time. We're talking about 1990, so I began showing my work in around 67. So this is not the first painting I made. Also, I rather deliberately like the idea of making paintings that could be misread as some kind of simple informational diagram. Very clear in my mind was to lessen the usual kind of overarching, well, the idea that one is doing a great painting. I wanted to just do something that one could pass by as if it's a bulletin board. And, oh, sorry. I mean, it's a deliberate kind of upping what might be considered a base thing into something you could consider in a more serious way. Mm-hmm. So it's not just making fun of people who make transcendent paintings, but to see that painting could also be not so self-elevating, self-aggrandizing, and be something that you could like look at.
Mm-hmm. But it's because it's also a strategy that had been recurring throughout your practice, that you were visiting, as it were, the history of the avant-garde. We just talked a few minutes ago about Van Doesburg, but also Malevich and other canonical figures of art history, that revisiting of that history through painting. Can you tell us a little bit about how it relates to the moment in time that you started? Because if you start in the late 1960s, painting wasn't much of an obvious choice.
Yes, in fact, it was probably one of the moments when painting was considered dead. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it was affected, and affected to the extent that it made painting both more difficult and at the same time a free area in which fewer people might be engaged in.
Mm-hmm. Because the term they often use to describe your work is then conceptual painting.
Well, I think all work is conceptual. I
was just going to say it's pretty much of a difficult term. Yeah. But what it hints at is that you seem to use history, like what's the base or the source material for painting. It's often a representation of the world as we see it. Traditionally it would be, but you seem to use source material in a very different manner. The facticity of someone's life, the facticity of someone's practice. Can you tell us a little bit about that approach, which you could indeed easily label as conceptual, but it produces very physical, tactile objects that are pleasurable to look at? I think.
Well, I hope they're pleasurable to look at, but there's a certain facticity of numbers. It's something everyone knows. We know how to count. We know what follows each number if you were to be in sequence. So I like using material that is known. I try to use material that everyone knows, but hopefully in a way that they haven't thought about or looked at before. This goes back to the geometrical paintings.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, everyone knows a square, a circle, a triangle, but yet the particular configuration is something that happens.
Mm-hmm. And suppose let's focus a little bit on the work in the back, because it occupies a central position in the show. So it's clear that it's a key work within the enterprise you're showing here. Can you tell us a few of the basic? I can point out a few. Well, you'll all have to turn back, obviously, but on the left we see the life cycle of Newman, and on the right it goes from 44.
His career, his public career of 27 years. Well, once I decided I was going to employ Barnett Newman's chronology of work as the subject for a painting, very quickly I realized I had to use some of the formal elements of his actual work in the painting. So his life of 70 years sequentially rendered became a kind of signature band, vertical band, like many of his paintings. And also he had done a group of work which he called Who is Afraid of Red, Yellow, Blue? And so unconsciously I gravitated to using red, yellow, and blue for this particular painting.
And does the format correspond to an existing work of Newman?
Well, not exactly. I mean, he didn't have to deal with specific, nameable subject matter as drawings, paintings, sculpture, prints, and other. One thing that I did do is, as a painter, well, it works in several ways. One of the reasons I happen to be a painter is in the history of cultural production, painting still has a kind of primordial place. So it is a burden. It's a burden and as well a reward to be able to occupy this elevated space. So in doing this, I very deliberately made painting not the biggest category, but to have it as just one of the categories of work. And I thought humorously enough to use the buzzword other as the biggest category. And other, in this case, is a synagogue that he designed, but it was never built.
Mm-hmm. And there's something about the red, because I knew the work only through reproduction. And I think one of the greatest...
That's why I'm a painter. I mean, one problem with this work, which I realize as a built-in handicap, is we see so much work in reproduction, and these paintings in reproduction become a small cipher of what they are. And you really need to see these. Every artist says this, oh, you have to see the work in itself to get what it is. But, I follow those artists and tell you that that's the case.
Because it brings us to the point where making a choice for a medium of painting while the source material is information comes to a crucial moment here where in reproduction it moves way more to the status of information, while your own experience or confrontation with the work here adds
becomes something other, if not more. Hopefully more.
Yeah. But what I find particularly interesting is about word, but why I've been looking at this work for quite a while is that it addresses that Barnett Newman is only into a cipher, like one potential example, but a very good one, because it addresses the idea of having a career. And a career that, if we look at it from a present-day perspective, is quite a particular one. He was 45 when he had his first solo show, and he sold nothing. Second solo show, he didn't sell. Sold one.
He sold one to Alfonso Osorio, one of the narrow ones.
Yeah.
But then, very interestingly, he wrote to Alfonso Osorio and said, "The climate is not right for the reception of my work, so I would like to buy it back."
Yeah. So one of the amazing things I think about Barnett Newman is that, since you know the work incredibly well.
Wow.
I've studied it the past 2 years quite intensively.
There are a lot of us devotees of
Yes,
Barnett
and we
Newman.
could probably spend 2 hours telling stories about Newman. But what it does is put into perspective the present day speed of an artist's practice or an artist's work, which I think is a major quality of your work, that it allows us to reflect on issues of practice.
Well, it's interesting because I think one of the facts of the biography of Barnett Newman that led me to nominate him as a center subject for myself was I was very moved by the fact that he had such a hard time having a career, that he was denigrated by most of his peers. And they took him seriously as a thinker, as a person they could invite to write texts for their shows. But Barney, well, he can't paint. This is what they said. And it must have been incredibly painful for him. And, I could also directly confess to the fact that the reason that was interesting for me is I myself felt very neglected for many years.
So it's, when you say nominate, it's an interesting term that you nominated Newman somehow as a subject for your work. There are others, and there's Motherwell, whom you also dedicated at least a few paintings to his work.
Malevich and Van Doesburg
and what makes
many
what makes Newman special, apart from
the fact that I met him, possibly as a term of personal biography, the enormous fact of how he was neglected, and the clarity and intelligence of his thinking.
And so the idea that your own biography interlinks both with the subject matter of your work.
Well, I wouldn't put so much on the connection. It's just, I probably, it was a big thing that I noticed how he was not given the respect that I thought he deserved, and thinking that I myself, might have had more respect along the way. So I want to make that as a public confession. And it seems to be an issue that, it's not just, say, with Barnett Newman. I also made a group of work about Melikov, the Konstantin Melikov, the Russian architect. And he too had a very difficult time. He had a brilliant beginning and got to build amazing things. But for 40 years of his life, he was not allowed to practice. And people thought, oh, it's because of Stalin and the regime. But in fact, it was his colleagues who were so jealous of his early success that they made it impossible. They took his license away and he was not allowed to practice.
And if you make those works, because it was definitely, but you publicly confessed that's something else, but definitely not my intention to try and distill from you that type of confession. But nevertheless, for example, that painting, 1956, 57, quite humorously called his gap years.
Well, you know, once the set of information one could go to the archive and study and find out. And along the way, I discovered that Newman did not do any work, even though he did very few works. He, in fact, did no work for 2 years. Of course, if you excavate a bit deeper, you realize the reason he didn't do any work was one, he was so disheartened by the reception that he received from his first two shows. But more importantly, he had a heart attack. So he couldn't really work. And so it seemed ready-made to somehow be imaged in some way. And, you know, very early on, I think we've all learned that absence is a kind of presence. And here it's a deliberate way to invoke that whole history of the monochrome, but not just the empty monochrome, a monochrome that actually tells you that emptiness is about something. And with there again, you know, without doing it about my own work, every artist, there's the typical idea that, you know, there's a kind of linear progressive development that the artist moves from one success to another. It becomes a kind of stepping into the future and forward and progress and so forth. But in fact, almost every artist I know has had stops and gaps and goes and productive times and very unproductive times. I myself was not able to proceed for several years because I simply didn't know what to do next. And here is Newman facing a similar dilemma.
I think we're arriving at a really interesting point, because what you seem to suggest, and I'm going to refer to a notion that was very dear to Barnett Newman himself, was subject matter. He said, what is truly important for an artist is to define what you would like to address. I'm not going to ask the question as directly, what is your subject matter? But could you then say that what you seem to address, paradoxically, by citing history and other people's work, is basically the notion of work and practice, the human endeavor to try and make something that is meaningful, and in this case, because it's art, rarely useful, but hopefully incredibly meaningful. So can you expand a little bit on, over, by now almost 50 years of work, how subject matter shifted throughout, and how your work allowed you to develop the stuff you'd like to work on?
Yeah, well, that's a question we could spend lots of time talking about. But obviously, a young artist thinks differently from an older artist, and I think when I began, I was much more like under the influence of whatever hegemony of thought was going on at the time. And I came to begin work at a moment of high formalism, where basically you're not allowed to deal with history or storytelling, or it could only be about the plastic formal elements if you're doing abstract painting. And I labored under those constraints. And in fact, it's those constraints that led me to stop painting, because there was simply a desert of how to proceed. And only at the point when I realized that what I wanted to do had to be impure in terms of formalism, that it became a catch-all for other things, that I was able to begin to do work again. And the artist, I think, is not a matter of finding your subject matter and that's it. In my case, I'm casting about for subject matter constantly, and usually coming up empty. And I'm very happy when a particular subject announces itself that it could have progeny.
Mm.
And when I started the Barnett Newman series, I didn't realize that it would continue so many years. I mean, since 1990 to now. And by now, there are 28 separate pieces. And hopefully, there'll be more.
But they are of very different nature, one could say. So if we look at the back, this his triangular paintings, but I'd like to go to the one that's in the other room, the purple one, which is called Spine, because once again it goes with like a personal story, but then resonates so beautifully with the type of images that Newman himself made. So can you tell us a little bit about that piece?
I mean, that goes, that's sort of the idea going in, is if you're dealing with Newman, you better have some formal elements that relate to what he did. Otherwise, it could be anything. The idea is it has to be something, and in some way reasonable. In the case of the purple painting, it's based, what even to say a work is based on something, this was not allowed in high formalist days. You know, it couldn't even be based on anything because already you're showing that it's related to something. It cannot relate to anything but itself. So it became a kind of tautological, you know, running around a circle in a room.
Barrelieva, yeah.
But in the case of the painting Spine, it's based on the catalog of the show, the Stations of the Cross at the Guggenheim Museum in 1966. In those days, even major museums printed very cheaply little pamphlets. And this was just a cheap little pamphlet, offset printing, but it had a very beautiful, deep purple color, coming, I suppose, in reference to the liturgical colors of the Passion during Lent. The color in the church is a kind of purple. And this was the reference, I think. I happen to have a copy of this book since 1966. It's sitting on my bookshelf. I don't take it out every week to look at, but obviously in 50 years' time, I've looked at it many times and put it back many times. And the fact of it is the spine became abraded into this fissure of white paper. And one day I happened to open it because I often do work based on covers of books. One day I opened it and I saw this fissure of the abraded spine. I immediately said, aha, there's a painting. Because there it is, a reference to Newman's zip, the passage of time and entropy, and some of those elements came into play. And of course, the painting had to be named Spine because I want to be very, direct in my information.
And I'm quite fond of the work, I must say. That's why I want.
You don't have to.
No, but I am. Because the information you gave obviously adds to our understanding of the piece, but makes it. I'm always interested in works that allow you to think further.
Yes, well, I like having the situation where I can, there are artists who say, oh, I don't want to explain my work because, the viewer should come to conclusions on their own. And I'm always interested, the more information you supply, the more the viewer could receive that and expand possibly, because it's not based on just, an amorphous something. It begins with something specific. And just thinking back to saying that a lot of work I do actually begins with the book cover, I might refer you to that other painting that says Newman de Kooning. That is a direct transcription from a little book as well. In 1961, Alan Stone, who was a fairly major gallery in New York, decided to make a show for Barnett Newman and de Kooning. And by 61, Newman's career was already becoming more solidified. He was no longer the pariah outside in the desert. And at the same time, de Kooning was considered the most important exponent of abstract expressionism. So Alan Stone wanted to do a show for the two titans of, say, the expressive and the intellectual wings of abstract expressionism. But of course, if he put one artist before the other, it would seem to say one is prior to the other. So to avoid that, he made this book that if you turn it one way, it begins with Newman, and if you turn it the other way, it begins with de Kooning. And I thought that's just brilliant. So,
do you ever change the painting?
Do I? You can. I mean, I could, but in the privacy of my studio. If I were showing it, I think Newman would have to take precedence.
Yeah, okay. We can discuss that later.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I would hang it the same way,
Yeah.
probably.
Well, it's just, I mean, maybe in the end it just comes down to taste as well. De Kooning never did anything for me in the same way. As great a painter as he was. So.
Because if you say this, de Kooning never did anything similar to something, if I may paraphrase you, what I find particularly moving about the work is that it's always a double take. Barnett Newman seems to be, at some point, merely an alibi to discuss other subject matter, while at the same time there is a profound liking of the work that goes together.
Mm-hmm.
And it shifts both ways. And I think some of the works have more of the direct link to Barnett Newman as an important figure for you, while others are addressing more larger issues.
Mm-hmm. Well, as much as I hold Barnett Newman high in the hierarchy, I'm also at the same time not taking him whole. I mean, I've always been somewhat critical of
it's not an ode to Barnett Newman.
It's not an ode to Barnett Newman.
That's is an important distinction.
It's not sheer homage. To pick him to begin with maybe is an act of respect, but at the same time, I basically would like to take him down a few notches, if you wish, to render his transcendent subject matter that people often take his subject matter to be, and render it as a series of numbers is a kind of sacrilege for a lot of people.
And you would do that for private reasons or amending the art historical canon? I think every artwork carries with it the ambition, small or large, change.
No, absolutely. I mean, a thing that still obtains for me is I do think of art as a critical act. You don't just swallow whole, what's been handed down. You do attempt to direct it elsewhere. And that's one of the reasons I often go to the kind of overlooked parts of it. It's almost like by looking at the outside of what is already considered the main picture, you can address things that are left out or forgotten.
The painting I probably find the most difficult one to deal with, even though at first it seems to be not the easiest one to read, but I can't really qualify it. Is the slashed canvas?
The slashed canvas,
the unfinished one, because it's also a work. The triangular works. There's basically one to see now at the Beaux-Arts, so you're all
Oh yes,
warmly
you
invited.
could go to Beaux-Arts and see Jericho, the black triangle painting. So it's great. They're very kind, Pompidou, to lend the painting during my show. Yes, well, the cut-up painting is a lucky break, actually. I mean, somebody happened to give me a JPEG of this painting, which is mostly not known because the conservator who has it under her guardianship at Harvard Conservation Labs is basically jealously guarding it so she could be the one doing research on it and be given the credit thereof. But I happen to get it, and it's not so arcane because the painting was presented at a discussion in, I forget what year, at the Getty Center with Eva Lambois and Carol Magnuso, I can't remember.
Ungaro.
Exactly. Yeah. So it is not part of the, considered part of Newman's actual oeuvre. And, you know, part of art, what art history does is it's a constant struggle to decide what could properly be in the oeuvre of a particular artist's work and what has to be evacuated. You know, this is happening for Rembrandt as well as for, you know, more contemporary artists. So as long as I'm still dealing with the subject of Barnett Newman, I felt very lucky to be given this image, which is a contested image. And the story of the painting is, and this is not the full scale of the painting. The painting is probably 215 centimeters tall, the actual painting. What the story is, Newman, before he died, asked his wife to destroy this painting because he didn't think it was good enough. So after he died, she destroyed it by having it cut up. But the same night, she had a dream that he came to her and said, "You are killing me." So the next day, she immediately tried to have the painting restored. But of course, it was done in such a way. One of the reasons it's cut up that way is so it would be very difficult to put back together for a restore. So she had it relined and then somehow stitched together. And it just was such an interesting, you know, anecdotal kind of story about this person that whose work and life I've been working with, as an example of, you know, larger class of other artists. You know, I happen to use him because of the ease of how few pieces he did and my prior respect for him and so forth. It's not one reason. It's, as you alluded to, a series of, you know, maybe even conflicting reasons. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I was very happy to be able to make work on that cut-up painting.
And can you tell us why? Because it's probably not the most, but it's a very painterly work.
Really?
I think so. But in comparison, because if you started from it's a very simple, basic question. If you started from a JPEG, the other side of the wall, you have two silk-screened images that were source images. Mm-hmm. Why, not why, can you elaborate a little bit on the decision to paint, repaint the image, which was basically a digital source, well, in comparison to the other ones at the other side of the wall? Just to understand that decision, why painting? Because it's a consistent choice. And
well, for me, like whatever occurs on a canvas is already a painting. So I don't have to paint it. Reason I use silk screen is I never had the art education that allowed me to render figures and objects in space. So whenever I deal with something like a photographic image, I would just use it straight as a silk screen. But in the case of the JPEG that presented the cut-up painting, there was enough planar information there to be made in a simple painted way. So that's why I did it. I suppose I could also make it as a silkscreen. In fact, that might give me a good idea. I might have to make it as a silkscreen.
Because I think it's one of the paintings, if you would isolate it from the show, would not so immediately refer to the work of Barnett Newman. That's why what I meant by painterly, in a sense, spine probably, but there the painterly reference is so explicit that you cannot, like it immediately, if you have a little art historical knowledge, it brings you to the work of Newman. While
well, the thing is, long ago I realized that no painting stands alone, even though there's the fiction under modernism that each painting is completely unique and has no connection even to anything else. I think paintings always exist in dialogue with other paintings, and they actually inform one another. One of the things about what has come to be called postmodernism is you realize you cannot give everything in one place, that you need almost, instances that address parts that cannot be addressed in one, can be addressed in the next. And the two taken together informs you in ways that each by itself could not have. And in this case, if I was only going to show the cut-up painting, well, it would be a very different story. But in fact, the particular narrative I'm presenting here allows it to be seen, if anything, almost as a coda. That as the beginning and the cut-up painting as the ending. Oh, by the way, I have the idea to make the cut-up painting. It's cut up, and I'm only rendering it as sketchy line referencing the cuts, but not actually cutting it. I have the idea of doing the same thing with the lines, not in this painting, in another painting, but have an industrial sewing machine sew up the lines as if those lines had been cut and then sewn together. And the reason I thought that was a funny idea was, well, I'm working with Newman's biography, and he was the son of a Jewish tailor, maker of men's suits, and he had to keep the family business alive when the father died. And so I wanted to reference the fact of him stitching the cloth.
And there's also the pretty sad story that he gathered a fortune to start off as an artist, and then through the depression lost most of the fortune.
Yes, the father said, "Come to the business with me. You work for a few years. After that, I'll set you up as a painter. You don't have to work, but just work for a few years in the family business." And then the depression happened, and that legacy went away.
We're not going to end on such a sad note, but just to close the discussion, because I think we're approaching 6. We're sitting with our backs almost to 2 works that address the triangular works, which I think are odd works by Newman. But you solved your own dealing with the issue of the triangular paintings in 2 quite significantly different ways. Can you tell us, to close off, because what is interesting, what you've just said, I think you said that the postmodernist practice is one that acknowledges the fact that you never solve your problem in one instance, that you have to return to the same question over and over again, recalibrate it, almost like cutting up a diamond, until maybe at the very end you will have it.
Well, this came first, and when I was doing this, I couldn't have imagined doing that, because I wasn't thinking of making little portraits of the paintings, but more like just the idea that he made these 2 triangular paintings. And at some point I said, oh, maybe I can actually make little portraits of those. So that's how that second one happened. And at the same time, it's another way of bringing him down to size, because his paintings are so large. And here I'm making almost comical, miniatures of his work.
Thank you, David.